I'd like to thank the Center for the Study of Societies for asking me to chair this session. It is indeed my privilege and my pleasure to do so. I have read, not all of it, but I have read Dr. Asif's book with great interest. And as I was reading it, there were three books that kept going through my mind, books that, kind of look at the notion of India, or the idea of India. One is, of course, Nehru's Discovery of India, his famous book that he wrote in Ahmednagar prison. And then, of course, there's The Idea of India by Sunil Khilani that came out in the late 1990s. The other book that went through my mind is Qurtul and Heather's Qadariya. But I must say that Dr. Asif's book has completely upturned my understanding of the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb by bringing in the centrality of the Deccan and Muhammad Qasim Farishta's book, which Dr. Asif's book is based on. So without any further ado, I would like to call Dr. Asif, who is an associate professor at Columbia University in New York. So Dr. Asif, I'd like to invite you to begin your presentation.
So thank you very much for this invitation to speak at the Center for Studies of Plural Societies. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, and I'm going to talk about decolonization, just because this is part of how Dr. Anas was talking about in terms of how do we understand pluralism and how do we get out of the question of nationalism versus internationalism. I have two books that I think are relevant to the conversation today. I'm an intellectual historian. Much of my work is centered around the question of history writing itself, as in how and why we write history, to what purpose. I'm interested in how people imagine Muslim arrivals or Muslim presence, both in South Asia, but Indian Ocean world. I will talk mainly about my book, The Loss of Hindustan, but I wanted to say a little bit about my first book because it kind of leads into the question that this book deals with. So my first book, which is a book of conquest, is a book that has a central question, which comes from, for example, a Pakistani textbook that you can read at the top here, right here, which is that it was in 712 AD that Muhammad bin Qasim attacked India and established the first Muslim rule in India. So this idea that Islam arrival begins with Muhammad bin Qasim, and he's the first citizen of Pakistan, which is obviously founded in 1947. And I wanted to interrogate how we think about this question of Muslim arrival and citizenship and belonging, something that, as mentioned earlier, is part of how we want to think about plural societies. So in this work, what I try to do is that I ask a set of questions, and why did the state of Pakistan claim that Muhammad bin Qasim was the, quote, first citizen of Pakistan? And I tried to answer this by looking at the earliest record that is reputably historical, which is from the Chashm-i-Nami, which is a Persian history written about the early part of the 13th century. And while this text, Chashm-i-Nami, claims itself to be a translation of an earlier Arabic text, it is indeed not, as I try to prove that it's something that's written specifically in the 13th century, responding to the pressures and particular political demands of the 13th century. And the second question that I tried to answer in that book was, even if it was written in the 13th century, how and why did it retain its importance? Who continued to read it? Why is it even a text that we build a historical case of? So in order to answer these questions, I began with actually looking at the text. And when you look at this is the text that one of the copies of the manuscript, which is this particular copy, is in the Punjab University Lahore Oriental Library. And when you look at the first page, what you see is that there is a particular, right here, there's a particular annotation that this book was written in a town called Uch Sharif. And hence I went to Ud Sharif. And why did I go to Ud Sharif? The reason I went to Ud Sharif was I wanted to think about the life of this book, life of this text, embedded in the landscape of Uj. And there I talked to people, I interviewed people. I tried to understand how and what the space, the land Uj has to say to the history of Islam's arrival, and what does the text in the 13th century imagine the world looks like. Now, as you may guess, the Uch of the 13th century looks nothing like the Uch of now, not because of the city has changed, the city is more or less the same, but because the idea of space has changed. The space that is imagined in the 13th century is now in present day bordered between India and Pakistan. And in fact, many of the campaigns, many of the pilgrimage sites, many of the important markers of space that are described in Chashm-i-Nami, I could not walk to them. I could not go see them because I'm a citizen of Pakistan and I was not allowed entry to do research there. So you can see that there is this, even if we are trying to think of the 13th century world, a world before partition, as historians of the contemporary, living in 2021, we cannot actually do so. An Indian historian wanting to work on Shah Jahan cannot go work in Lahore. Someone like me cannot go work in Rajasthan or in the Deccan. So how is that reality, our contemporary reality, shape the way in which we understand the deep history? And I think that's where I was struggling with in my first book. And that's where I stayed, and I basically made an argument in that book that the Chashm-i-Nami, as I mentioned earlier, is not a book of translation. In fact, it's actually a political theory for rule. And as a political theory, it draws on specific types of texts. For example, it draws upon Panchatantra tales, it draws upon Arthashastra, it draws upon Shahnama, Firdausi. And all of these are sources that it includes in its theory for what constitutes a good ruler who can be kind and just to its polity, but also what constitutes a member of the polity, a citizen, if you want to use contemporary language, but a subject would be more proper. And what is the relationship of governance? How do we conduct rule over people who are of different religions, different faiths, Shia, Sunni, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, various caste groups? All of these things are covered in the Chashm-i-Nami. And the way that the Chashm-i-Nami argues that this should be done is to do it as a part of a dialogue. And the dialogue here is important because Chashm-i-Nami includes long conversations that are just basically voices that are that are talking to each other, voices of different people. So this idea of dialogue, we have to speak. The idea of didacticness, teaching, we have to say the lessons that we want people to learn from each other. And thirdly, demonstration. We have to kind of build something. We have to create a madrasa, a school. We have to create a court. We have to create a law that demonstrate the value of dialogue, the value of teaching. And this is really important that, you know, the way in which colonial historiography later on would argue that Islam is a religion of the sword. It begins with the sword and it spreads by the sword. And so when you think of the sword, there's no dialogue. You can't dialogue with the sword. There's no didacticness. It's not a pedagogical tool. You don't teach with a sword. You just kill with a sword. And the only demonstration that the sword allows is the one of violence. So this idea of Islam as a religion of the sword is very, very deep. So you can find it in as early as Martin Luther, the famous Protestant reformer who in the early part of the 16th century it basically writes this treatise on war against the Turks, in which he does translate bits of the Quran. And so as early as Martin Luther, you see this idea that Islam is a religion of sword, and this idea continues. So, but when you look at 13th century Persian history written in Uch, no such idea is there. So this purported book of conquest actually is a book about dialogues. It's a book about didacticness. And so what I ended up doing for this project was that I ended up looking at how in the early part of the 19th century, a group of East India Company political agents, people like McMurdo, Hostins, Burton, and a group of historians like Eliot and Elphinstone basically used the Chashm-i-Nami to argue that Muslims do not belong to the subcontinent. They are outsiders. They came by sword from Arabia, and that they need to be expelled. They needed to be quarantined. They needed to be not considered Indian. That led me to think about how to basically historicize a history of belonging. How do we understand belonging? What does it mean to be, as this center says, a member of a plural society? Is that a project for the future, or is this a project that we can have historical antecedents for? So I want to talk about the book that I've written, The Loss of Hindustan, Invention of India. Dr. Ali gestured towards two texts that I think I had in mind very much: Nehru's Discovery of India, as well as Sunil Khilani's Idea of India. Those were certainly texts that I was thinking of and reading and working with in order to kind of create my argument. Here's what I wanted to do with this book. I wanted to decolonize the philosophy of history, and philosophy of history, for if people are unfamiliar with this term, is basically an invention of the mid to late 18th century, as I show in the book, by a set of Europeans who are making a claim that, unlike Christian church histories, where the reason something happens, A to B, event to event, life to death, is because of God, right? God is the driver of history, is the engine through which historical things kind of churn. Perfect example is Augustine's City of God, in which he says the reason Rome was destroyed was because of pagan ritual, and the city of God has to be established in which the reason for the destruction of Rome, the reason for time to move forward, is God. So in the mid to late 18th century, a number of theorists, Voltaire, Hume, Kant, make an argument that actually we have to find other reasons for why things happen in the world. You know, it's not just God. There's other things that drive the reason for why empires rise and fall, you know, lands are colonized, which is something that's happening. They're trying to theorize it. And in this theorization, they create a field called philosophy of history, which is a field that tries to figure out why things happen. And I wanted to decolonize it, which meaning I wanted it to take the roots of its idea of why something happens away from the colonial context, colonial episteme, and see if there are other ways of thinking about why things happen other than Europe. I also wanted to think about something I call in the book political forgetting. And by this, I mean that, you know, while nation states are eager to remember something, right? We want to remember a particular hero. We want to remember a particular event as nation states, I mean. And that's, you know, the commemorations that we hold, particular days that we celebrate as holidays. There's a very equal, kind of perhaps even larger part of this, which is political forgetting. in which we forget certain things. We do not commemorate them. We do not teach them to our students. We do not talk about them. What are those things? What are the things that we are forgetting rather than things that we are just remembering? And finally, the project of this book is to write a concept history of Hindustan. And by concept history, I mean something very different than Hindustani as we talk about today. So when we say the word Hindustani, we sometimes mean Hindustani music, or we can mean the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, or Hindustani, a type of Hindustani dress, or Hindustani culture, or Hindustani speech. But what I mean by Hindustan, and what my sources are talking about when they talk about Hindustan, is basically an idea. And this idea is larger than a particular food, a particular dress, a particular ritual. It's larger than a particular polity. It's not an idea that is related to just a political power, one particular power. It's larger than that. And that's what I wanted to kind of put towards my audience. Now, the book basically begins with the moment that I say the loss happens. The loss is not 1947. The loss, in fact, I trace to the early part of the 20th century. And I use two examples. The examples I use is one, which is Muhammad Iqbal's Tarana-e-Hindi, Sare jahan se acha Hindustan hamara, hum bulbule hain iski ye gulistan hamara, which is in 1904. And that's, I'm sure, familiar to many of you as an anthem to this day. And at the same time, in 1908, Savarkar also writes a tarana on Hindustan. And Savarkar's tarana in 1908 and Iqbal's tarana in 1904 are actually quite different. They imagine two very different ideas of Hindustan. And in the Savarkar idea of Hindustan, Hindustan, in a Sanskritized sense, is a place just for Hindus. And while Christians, etc., can live there as citizens, the idea of Muslim belonging is, for Savarkar, not a possibility, because Muslims, as he says, pray with their face turned towards Mecca. So they're always looking outside of the subcontinent, and they can never claim a sense of belonging. And so as early as the 20th century, the first decade of 20th century, these two competing notions are concretized as politics, and they kind of play out, but I don't really go into what happens after that. As a medievalist, I'm interested in things that happened before. So that's the kind of end point. Now, in that sense, you know, the things that as I mentioned, that there are stuff that I do not cover in this book. Language, there is a Hindustani language. There are words that we know. There's a tehzeeb, that's the great movie Shatranj Ke Khiladi, which kind of talks about the decline of that civilization. Classical music, as I mentioned, I don't cover any of those things. Not because I don't care about them or they're not important, because I wanted to kind of focus on the idea, the concept first. And I think other historians do this work and do it much better. I start my story a little before William Jones, but I think this is a important starting point. So William Jones, who is a judge in Bengal, one of the earliest people who is responsible for colonial law, a philologist, someone who writes extensively on language, does translations of critical works like Shakuntala and Manu's Code. And this is, I think, a very important quote from him. And he says, by India, I mean, in short, that whole extent of country in which the primitive religion and languages of the Hindus prevail at this day with more or less their ancient purity, and in which Nagari letters are still used with more or less deviation from their original form. So one of the things that we are kind of have internalized is that Hindustan is somehow Muslim and India is somehow a more secular idea or more politically capacious idea. But in fact, it's the opposite, that Hindustan was the more capacious political idea, and India, as imagined by the colonial state from Hindustan, was the more restrictive idea in which Muslims were taken out of it. And this quote basically demonstrates that India is the place where Nagari languages, the script is, and the relationship between script and space. Again, as you can see, this is almost 100 years before the Urdu-Hindi script question is going to become is so important. And 100 years before Sayyid Ahmad Khan, etc., the Urdu-Hindi question begins, you can see that the colonial state is already created an idea of British India or India that is based only on the Sanskrit or Nagari. So the question that I think I wanted to frame is how do we rethink the historiography of the colonial period, right? As medievalists, how do we, as we talk about it, what is the methodology with which a Mughal historian can read the time period before the colonial period? And what I try to offer in this work is a purposeful staging, a staging between colonial episteme and the histories of Hindustan. Why? Because I think we cannot ignore, we cannot pretend that the colonial state is only kind of a period of time, and that if we work on a period of time before the colonial state, then we don't have to worry about this particular part of history. What I try to demonstrate is that no matter what period of time, whether we're working on the ancient India or medieval India or modern India, all of our questions, our sources, our way of asking things is determined by the colonial period. So we have to engage with it. We have to think about this episteme, as I call it, the way of knowing. And so when we think about the political forgetting that I mentioned earlier, political forgetting of the word Hindustan, we also think the reason that happens is because of something I call the colonial episteme. Episteme, way of knowing. Now, how did the colonial episteme shape India and made us politically forget Hindustan? It did so by collecting, archiving, organizing, excerpting textual and objects from our deep past, and then representing it. This is not just the British who are doing this. This is the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the German. So this is a wider scope. And India is part of a conversation with Africa. It's part of the conversation with the quote unquote new world. And so we have to kind of look at this in a much broader scale as a global history than simply a history of what is happening in our part of the world. Now, and there are important precedents for why and how these things happen. People, especially people who work in political science or political theory, are probably very familiar with figures like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And again, if we look at Hobbes, whose Leviathan comes out in the middle of the 17th century, who is a secretary for Francis Bacon. So Bacon and Hobbes are really invested in thinking about an ancient world that gives the contours, the political sensibility to the contemporary world in which they live in. And what they want to argue for, that there is a state of nature in which man is pitted against man, and there is a political consensus and argument, a state making in which under a king, King James I, for example, under which political power could be unified. Now, these ideas about state of nature, conflict, and a political ruler who has political ideas will develop over the period of the 17th and 18th century, and Muslims, the Muslimness will be predicated on this idea of savagery, of state of nature, while civilization will become something that Europeans have under liberalism, that they can provide to those who acquire the right language, English, the required. So this is the world in the 17th century, early 17th century, where under political rule in England, in Netherlands, in Germany, a type of idea of the deep past is being articulated. Now, you ask yourself, what's so special about the early 17th century? Are these individuals who are trying to make an argument of state of nature, of political rule, are they basically at the head of a world that we cannot understand because it's foreign to us? Actually, no. At the exact same time as our friends here, Hobbes, Locke, there are other people who are invested in this idea of the political rule. One of those people is the person that I write this book about, and this is Muhammad Qasim Farishta. So another space in the Deccan where there is a polity with multiple rulers, multiple claims to rule. There is a negotiation. Who gets to rule? What's the idea of the deep past, the ancient history, to the current rule in Golconda, or in Gulbarga, or in Bidar? And how are these political entities trying to articulate themselves against the Mughal rule or against Vijayanagar? This is the same kind of worldview that is causing Hobbes and Bacon and Locke to write their treatises at the same time. So same time, do different parts of the world, same problem. Multiple claims to the past, multiple ideas, political power. But there's one incredible difference. What emerges in European thought as man is made in pure conflict, must fight another man for power unless we enter into a Leviathan, does not happen the same way here. There is no idea that conflict is internal to either the condition of man or to man here. I do want to say the capital M, so I'm not trying to be gendered, but this is the capital M man, human, let's say. And nor is it about a religion, that a religion is simply a religion of sword and cannot talk. So I look at the Deccan, where you have in the same time period, you have 4 different polities, they have different rulers, they are in various kinds of negotiation with the political powers up north as well as further down south. One would imagine that these intellectuals who are based in these places will also see the world through this same idea of conflict. But they don't. They don't see it through the same idea of conflict. And that's an important thing for us to understand, that unlike Europe, unlike European thought, which is predicated on the idea of colonization, okay? We cannot forget this. Europe is invested in the enslavement, transportation, and labor of human beings from Africa at this moment. They are seeing the world through the idea of conflict where they capture and transport other human beings. That is not something that's happening in the Deccan, and that's not the world they imagine. The political theorists sitting in Deccan do not imagine a world like the political theorists sitting in London. Important thing, same time, same exact moment in history. So the person that I focus on is Muhammad Qasim Farishta. He's born in Ahmednagar in the Deccan. He works for Nizam Shahi. He's a diplomat. He's a medical person. So he basically is commissioned to write a history that he titles Gulshan-e-Ibrahimi, or Narasnama, a new history. And he's exactly the contemporary of Francis Bacon, And he's exactly the contemporary of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon is at the same moment writing a history of his deep past, as Farishta is writing a history of his deep past. And the reason I'm emphasizing is that, you know, we tend to imagine Europe being the universal signifier from which we get our theory. So we say, well, political state must look like this because we have read Hobbes, and Hobbes says this is what a political state must look like. Well, friends, if you read Farishta at the same moment as Hobbes, you're going to see a very different political state, right? And that's important. That's important to decolonize our ideas of what political state means for us. So this is the text he writes. This is a manuscript that's currently in Scotland. This is Tarikh-e-Farishta. This is the front page of it. And what I do, what Farishta does and what I do is that Farishta looks at Hindustani historians before him. So he reads Arthashastra, he reads Mahabharata, he reads Firdausi, Aufi, Jurjani. He conducts interviews with different people. This text then is taken up by Colonial. I'll talk a little bit about Colonial historians. And then, of course, the Hindustani historians continue to read this. There are translations of Farishta into Malayalam, into Kannada, into Gujarati, into Bengali, into Marathi, all of them in the 18th and early 19th century. And of course, Urdu and Hindi versions that begin much in the late part of the 19th century. So Farishta has a very important part of our historiography. Some of the questions I asked was how and why did Farishta want to write a history of Hindustan as a whole, not just the kingdoms that he was a part of, not the Mughal elite. He wanted to do the space, the idea of Hindustan. Why and how he wrote this text, what did he draw upon, and who and where was his history. So a couple of things that I want to highlight is what Farishta says is that he is not writing a history like anyone else has ever written before. And what he means by that is that if you look at some of the dominant form of history writing before him, you have, there's 3 examples. So you have an idea, something like Babur-Name, which is Waqayat-e-Baburi, which is sort of a history written by a person, a memoir, we can call it, or auto life writing, we can call it. So that's one idea of, you have histories that are kind of like that. You have something like Tabaqat-e-Akbari. Again, this is Nizamuddin Ahmed, but Tabaqat is a way of kind of stages of political rule version of history. That goes back to Tabari in Arabic. So it goes back to 9th century. So that's another model. What you do is basically you write about generations of rulers from the beginning to the period that the person is writing in. And finally, you have a model like Akbar-Name, which is a history of a political power, particular political power, right? So these are 3 models: person, generations, and one polity. What Farishta does is, in fact, none of these things. What he does is he arranges his history by space, by place, right? So we're not talking about generations of people. We're not talking about individual rulers. We're talking about regions or areas. He begins with, a wonderful chapter on kind of the history from Mahabharata. He goes into Lahore, etc., 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 and he ends with the kind of basically a travel, what we would now call a travel brochure of Hindustan. What's so amazing about this place that I belong to, right? All over. This is not one ruler. This is not one region. This is all of Hindustan. What's amazing about all of this Hindustan? For him, Hindustan is from Kabul to Bengal, from the Himalayas to what we now call Lanka. So the reason I wanted to focus on Farishta is because the colonial state says the history of Farishta is universally known in India, at least by name, and there are a few large towns without a copy. If we add these works labeled Norasnama, Tarikh Ibrahimi, which few of the present ignorant generation know to be the same as Farishta's history, we shall find that it is probably more common than any secular work of equal size in this country. So in the mid to early part of the 19th century, the colonial state says there are basically no other book more popular than Farishta in the subcontinent. Now, this is really important because Farishta disappears. we never hear of him again, and that is also part of this loss of Hindustan that I wanted us to kind of think about. There are many histories that I mentioned that are based on Farishta. They extend really up to the mid part of the 18th, early 19th century. Urdu translations are made in the early part of the 20th century. But quickly, I want to just say a little bit about how Farishta becomes part of the intellectual history of Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Dow is someone who is a very important colonial figure. He's responsible for not only the Great Bengal famine, he's also responsible for the idea of permanent settlement, which is, again, very important for our understanding of polity, that you need to have property land. This is a concept that they are going to take from the Portuguese, who established this as the idea of plantation in the Pacific and then the Atlantic Oceans. The British take this idea of permanent land settlement and extend it to the Americas and extend it to the Bengal. Dow is the person who is going to take Farishta, and in 1768 and 72, he's going to make renditions of the history of Hindustan, as it says here, based on Farishta, based on Muhammad Qasim Farishta of Delhi, he says, which is wrong, but sure. And these texts are published in 68 and 72, are incredibly popular, immediately translated into French and into German. Dow is a very good friend of David Hume. Hume is very good relations with Voltaire and Kant. These translations are found in Kant's library. They're found in Voltaire's citations of universal history. So you see an immediate kind of global European take-up of Farishta's, his rendition of Farishta. You see then the idea of world history, universal history, philosophy of history is then written through their engagement with Farishta, how Farishta talks about the concept of history. And you see this in Kant, you see this in Herder, you see this in later on in Hegel. And so what we see is that a text that's coming from the Deccan basically goes into the philosophy of history of Europe, but is in the footnotes and then disappears. So it's not something, they don't cite Farishta. They don't say we're taking this knowledge from Farishta. They simply take the knowledge and only do not even mention Farishta in the body of the text. So this is important, again, for the ways in which we need to decolonize the idea of philosophy of history. And Hegel, as I mentioned earlier, he's certainly a very influential figure and who relies on Farishta translation. So the idea for me was also then to kind of think about how the history is used not only within the subcontinent, but by Europe, and how we write the history of Hindustan then becomes an important idea for how we talk about a figure like Farishta or a space like Hindustan. Where was Hindustan then, right? So while the 19th century creates this idea of Hindustan very, very specifically, first it says it's just a Mughal rule, then it says it's just Ganga Jamna, then it says it's just Delhi and few regions around it. So it shrinks, it keeps shrinking. And if you look at the maps produced by the East India Company in the early part of the 17th century, where Hindustan is the subcontinent, you will see the same kind of shrinking of the word Hindustan, Industan, and finally being replaced by the word British India, and then subsequently to that, just India. So the India that is invented by the colonial power is full of cliches. It's full of religious antagonism that is intended to be factual and true. But Hindustan is then in the colonial imagination is then something that's really fake. It's like false harmony. It's not really together. It's just limited. It has forgotten languages. Nobody knows Dakkani. What is Dakkani? What is Hindustani? Languages are forgotten. Ideas of space is forgotten. Persian histories are Muslim and thus cannot be read. They're not tied to anyone else. No one knows it. No one understands Farsi. Nobody cares about Farsi. People are Hindu. Hindus don't care about Farsi. These are all ideas that are put forward by the colonial state and then are internalized by people like us, basically. And what happens is that while this is happening over the course of the late 19th, early 20th century, there are a series of people upon whom I draw upon to say that this is not, in fact, correct. And I wanted to show you some of these faces. These are historians who are writing about the medieval world. Shafat Ahmad Khan, who is one of the first presidents of the Indian Historical Congress, Maulvi Zakaullah, that I talk about in the book, of course, Professor Muhammad Habib, who wanted to write his dissertation on Farishta at Cambridge, but he stops it to come back and fight for the freedom of this country, of subcontinent. Sayyid Hassan Askari, Atar Ali, of course, Muhammad Amin. These are all people who are writing about the medieval period, who are basically trying to understand the Hindustan that Farishta has been talking about against the colonial ideas and then later on the nationalist ideas of history writing. So I feel like the ways in which we approach the concept of history writing is very important for us in the sense that we need to write a different history with a different idea for what future that is possible for us. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Asif. Without any exaggeration, let me just say it was a sheer delight listening to this very, very broad-ranging talk, which spans 5 centuries, and it does it with such an effortless sweep. Now, I'm so happy that you mentioned the 17th century. And when you talk about the 17th century, you specifically mention what is for a political scientist like me a very happy hunting ground. I mean, political scientists will always talk about Hobbes and Locke. Now, I completely agree with you that the imagination of the state that you find in people like Hobbes and Locke is very different from the way that Farishta is talking about it. But the text that I was reminded of is a book written by someone who is born exactly a year after Farishta's death. Farishta dies in 1630. And the person I have in mind is someone called Henry Stubb, who was born in 1631. And in 1671, if I'm not wrong, writes a book called An Account of the History of the Rise and Progress of Mohammedanism, which is a remarkably sympathetic account of Islam, not as a religion of the sword, but as a religion which peacefully spreads from Arabia into the rest of the world. Now, the remarkable thing about this book is that it remains in manuscript form for well over 250 years. And wonder of wonders, it gets published in 1911 in Lahore. So in the way that you talk about Farishta traveling to Europe, one finds Henry Stubb's book written in Oxford. I think Stubb was the second keeper of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And the fact that the manuscript was never published, but then is published in British India, it's a kind of a reverse circuit of the way that you talk about Farishta's book traveling to Europe. So that's one point. The second point that I was thinking about as you spoke is, and I would again thank you for writing this book and for someone like me who read it, it has opened me to the multiple resonances of Hindustan and what we have lost in what you call the loss of Hindustan. Now, just to give you a very contemporary example of this, people who are not in this part of the world right now, let me just kind of tell them what's going on in Delhi and in its suburb, a suburb called Gurugram, as it's called, Gurgaon as earlier. Now, there's a huge contestation over Muslims wanting to pray, especially Friday prayers in the open. There's been opposition from right-wing Hindu nationalists. Now, remarkably, there was a news item today where members of the Sikh community very graciously offered to give their gurudwaras for Muslims to pray in. So I was talking to some colleagues in the morning, and we were reminded of Iqbal's, again, the beautiful song, Sare Jahan Se Achha, that famous line, Mazhab nahi sikhata aapas mein bair rakhna, Hindi hai hum, watan hai Hindustan hamara. So when we talked about Hindustan, I was immediately reminded of the way that there are multiple resonances of Hindustan. And again, if I can add one further point, and I make this point with a great deal of sadness, because just a few days ago, we commemorated, celebrated Iqbal Day, 9th of November. And in the Indian media, I was stunned to see the way in which Iqbal is being attacked, ahistorically, ignorantly, in a Philistine manner. And of course, Iqbal, as you rightly say, especially in that beautiful song, Sare Jahan Se Achha, captures what Hindustan was and what we may have lost, perhaps irrevocably, irretrievably, and I say this with a great deal of sadness. I must thank Dr. Asif once again for this absolutely wonderful talk.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank Dr. Anas and Dr. Ali for hosting me. Thank you to all of the interns and all of the scholarship that you're doing. I hope if you need to, please send me an email. I'm happy to answer further questions. Thank you very much.